Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Chinese economy, because the initial economic data that's been released for December shows that there are continuing concerns about what's happening in China. This chart shows the official rate of inflation in China over the past 12 months. And one thing to note here is that the scale on the right-hand side of this chart goes from 1% positive at the top to 1% negative at the bottom. And the reason that that's important in terms of our analysis is that the target rate of inflation set by China is 3%. So you can see that over the past 12 months, China has been nowhere near its target rate of 3%. And if we start off by looking at what was happening 12 months ago, you can see that prices were actually falling. In December, they came down by 0.3%. And in January 24, they fell year on year by 0.8%. And when prices are falling in an economy, that's referred to as deflation, which is an absolute nightmare because it makes it very difficult for companies to be able to pass on any cost increases. Now, over the past 10 months, prices have actually been increasing, but the rate of increase has been very low. The highest price increases over this period were seen in February, when they increased by 0.7%. However, in March, April, May and June, price increases fell back below 0.3%. There was then a slight recovery in July and August, when we saw an increase of 0.6%. However, over the past 4 months, the rate of increases in prices has been falling, and the latest data for December 24 show that year on year, prices only increased by 0.1%. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 3 years, you can see that China has been struggling with price increases since April 2023, so for the last 20 months. And if we have a look at this chart, which shows the month-on-month movements in prices, you can see what the problem is, because in 6 out of the last 9 months, China has experienced a month-on-month fall in prices. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, surely low inflation's a good thing, because I've seen lots of videos that you've made talking about the problems of high inflation, and I admit I have made lots of videos talking about the problems of high inflation, but low inflation and deflation can be just as big a problem, and particularly for China, because China is a manufacturing country. That's what it does. It makes things and then sells them both to Chinese consumers and also everybody else in the world. And when you've got deflation, when you've got prices that are either not rising or going down, that becomes a major problem for all of the companies in your economy, because those companies will have rising prices. Raw material prices around the world have gone up over the past 2 years, but Chinese businesses have been struggling to pass on those price increases, and so they're having to absorb all of those additional costs, and that means that their profits have been falling, and lots of Chinese businesses are now making losses. This chart shows the year-on-year movement in producer prices, which are also referred to as factory gate prices. So this is the price of products as they're leaving Chinese factories. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart starts at 0% and goes down to minus 3.1%. And what this chart shows is that over the past 12 months, producer prices in China have fallen in every single month. And the latest data for December 24 shows that year-on-year factory gate prices are down by 2.3%. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 3 years, you can see that producer prices have actually fallen in every single month since October 2022. So for the last 26 months. And what that means is that Chinese businesses have been absorbing the global cost increases for more than 2 years. And that is an absolute disaster for any business, because if you can't pass on any of your cost increases, then basically you start making less and less profit. And at some point you move into making losses. And it's estimated that over 40% of businesses in China are currently making losses. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I recently posted a video talking about the fact that Joe Biden has applied the most severe sanctions against Russia that we've seen since Russia's invasion of Ukraine started. He's sanctioned the 2 largest state-owned oil companies in Russia directly. And this is a major sea change, because up until this point, the West had been trying to control what was happening with Russian oil by applying price caps. So basically making sure that Russian oil that was being sold was not sold above $60 per barrel for crude oil and roughly speaking around $100 per barrel for refined oil. But now they've gone straight to the heart of the matter and banned the two companies that are selling Russian oil. And the problem with this is that it will now restrict the global supply of oil, and as a result, it's forced up oil prices. This chart shows the movement in the price of Brent crude oil over the past 12 months, and the thing that I really wanted to highlight here is what's happened to the price in 2025. You can see that there's been a sharp uptick, and over the past couple of weeks, it's risen by more than 13%. And if we have a look at what's been happening to the price of Russian oil, you can see that it's moved in exactly the same way as Brent crude oil. And in fact, the price of Russian oil has increased at a faster rate than Brent crude. And the reason why I'm talking about the increase in oil prices is that the cost of oil is critical to the Chinese economy. It represents one of its largest import categories. Around 20% of all of China's imports relate to fuel. And the latest global price increases in oil are going to hurt the Chinese economy even further because it's going to push up their costs at a time when Chinese businesses are struggling to be able to pass on those costs. So this is likely to result in further losses being made by Chinese businesses. One of the other major issues that China is facing right now is that Donald Trump, who takes over as the president on the 20th of January, has said that he's going to apply additional tariffs of at least 10% against all Chinese imports. And obviously that's going to hurt Chinese trade. This chart shows the year-on-year movement in the value of China's exports over the last 12 months. And what I wanted to highlight here is that in December there was a significant increase. Year-on-year exports increased by 10.7%. So you may think that that looks like a positive move in terms of the Chinese economy. However, in reality, what we are seeing here is a lot of businesses in the USA are placing large orders at the moment in China to beat the tariffs. They're looking to buy at the lower price before the new tariffs are applied and prices go up significantly. So this is potentially a last hurrah before Donald Trump comes in and the level of trade between the USA and China falls. And to highlight the fact that China is not gearing up for a strong 2025, this chart shows the year-on-year movement in China's imports over the last 12 months. And the reason why this is important is because China imports a lot of raw materials in anticipation of passing them through the manufacturing process and then exporting finished products. So when we see a rise in the value of imports, it means that China is buying in lots of raw materials so that it can expand its manufacturing and export more products. However, what this chart shows is that over the past 5 months, the movement in the value of imports has been very low. In August 24, the value only increased by 0.5%. That fell to 0.3% in September. And in October and November, we actually saw the value of imports falling in China. In October, it went down by 2.3% and fell by 3.9% in November. Now, in December, there was a slight recovery. The value increased by 1%. However, when you consider that China has set a GDP growth target of 5%, a 1% year-on-year increase is nowhere near enough what China needs to be able to achieve that. This chart shows the year-on-year movement in gross domestic product in China, which is reported quarterly over the past 3 years. Now, as you're probably aware by now, the GDP target that's been set by the Chinese authorities for 2024 is growth of 5%, and they've also set that same level for 2025. And what we can see here is that in the first quarter of 2024, China achieved year-on-year growth of 5.3%. So at that point, things were looking good to achieve the 5% target for the full year. However, by the halfway point of 24, the year-on-year movement had fallen to 4.7%, and in the third quarter it fell further to 4.6%. So in order to achieve year-end growth of 5%, China will need to see a very strong last quarter. However, the data that we've just looked at does not indicate that China is currently performing exceptionally well, and there is obviously a further question mark as to whether they can achieve that same figure for 2025. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because China is the second largest economy in the world, and what happens in China is important to the global economy. And what we've seen from today's data is that the problems that we've been following over the last few months in China are continuing, and in fact, they're getting worse because inflation is now down to 0.1%. It is barely above zero. And that is a major problem for China because China is a manufacturing country. A lot of its business is based on companies making things and selling them all around the world. And the cost of raw materials has been rising over the last couple of years. So Chinese businesses have seen their costs going up at the same time as their prices have gone down. And we saw from the factory gate price data that that's actually been going on for more than 2 years. And that's an absolute nightmare. You can imagine if you were running a business and you were constantly having to cut your prices whilst your costs were going up, at some point you'd want to throw the towel in, because that's not a sustainable business model. These Chinese businesses don't have enough profit margin to be able to absorb it. When you think about Chinese products, they're sold at a relatively low price all around the world. So the margins are quite thin. So they don't have a lot of headroom to be able to absorb costs. And what we've seen is that over the last 2 years, all of that headroom has been wiped out. And it's estimated that at least 40% of Chinese businesses are now making losses. And this is a major problem for the Chinese economy, because all of those businesses making losses means that the Chinese economy isn't growing anywhere near as fast as the Chinese authorities need it to. And as we saw from the data, there is a big question mark as to whether or not China will be able to deliver GDP growth of 5% for 2024 or 2025. And if it doesn't, then the Chinese economy is going to be really struggling, because it's been taking on more debt. I've made lots of videos talking about how much debt both individual companies have in China, but also all of the local governments have taken on huge amounts of debt. They've got lots of bonds. And so the economy is really highly geared. So it needs to keep achieving growth in order to keep paying for all of that debt. And if GDP is now in decline and Chinese consumers are no longer buying, so we've got prices going down, this represents a serious issue for China and the Chinese authorities. And as I mentioned, it's the second largest economy in the world. So if China is now slowing down, we're going to have a knock-on impact to all of the other countries, because China will buy less raw materials from all of those countries. And so that's going to cause an issue. And also we've got Donald Trump coming in, who's going to be applying additional tariffs onto Chinese goods. That's likely to reduce the demand for Chinese products in the USA. So therefore, Chinese businesses will export less. And so we may see an acceleration in the decline in GDP. So China is now sitting at a really critical point in terms of its economy. And what happens over the next 3 to 6 months is going to be really critical to whether or not they can achieve the growth that they need to keep paying for all of their debt. And if they don't, then it could be a major problem, not just for China, but also for the global economy. And I'll keep you posted as soon as any more data is released. But hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.